The station called Threshold floated in the cold dark of space, spinning slowly around a star that had died a long time ago. And the light that touched its metal walls was old and tired and gray, like the memory of something that used to burn bright, but had forgotten how. Inside the station, hundreds of species walked through wide halls made of black glass and silver steel, and the air smelled of 1,000 different worlds, because every delegation brought their own atmosphere filters and food and perfume, and the sounds of alien languages filled every corner, like music played by instruments no human hand had ever touched. Sergeant Elias Kane stood near a pillar in the grand reception hall with a glass of water in his hand, and he watched the room the way a man watches the ocean, not because he expected danger, but because he had learned a long time ago that danger never announces itself before it arrives. He wore a plain gray uniform with no medals, no ribbons, no decorations of any kind, and the only mark on his chest was a single chevron that told the world nothing about who he was or what he had done. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Ambassador Dara Moten moved through the crowd like water through stones, shaking hands and tendrils and claws with the grace of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to make aliens feel comfortable. And every few minutes she would glance back at Elias, not because she needed him, but because she needed to know he was still calm. He was always calm, and that was what scared her most about him. The reception was for the Galactic Territorial Summit, a meeting that happened once every 30 cycles to settle disputes over star systems and resource worlds, and this cycle the big fight was between humanity and the Aethkari Empire over a system rich in quantum minerals that both species needed for their drive cores. The Aethkari were tall and beautiful in a way that made other folks seem dull. Species feel small, with skin that shifted colors like oil on water, and long curved horns that rose from their skulls like crowns. And on those horns they carved marks, one for every enemy fleet they had destroyed, one for every world they had conquered, one for every victory they had claimed. The more marks you carried, the more respect you commanded. And the Aethkari delegation that walked into the reception hall that evening carried enough marks between them to fill a library of war. At their front walked Valith Soreni, junior fleet commander and daughter of one of the oldest noble houses in the empire, and her horns were carved so thick with tallies that they caught the light and threw tiny shadows across her iridescent face like a crown of scars. She moved through the room, and the crowd parted for her the way water parts for a blade, and her voice was loud and sharp, and carried the kind of confidence that comes from never once being told no. "The Great Threshold," she said to her officers, letting her eyes sweep across the hall with open boredom. "I expected something grander, but I suppose when you build a station for lesser species, you build it to lesser standards." Her officers laughed, and the sound was bright and cutting, and several alien delegates nearby shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, because the Aethkari fleet was one of the largest in the galaxy, and nobody wanted to be the one to start a problem. Valith's eyes moved across the room like searchlights, and they landed on the human delegation, and then they landed on Elias. She studied him the way a predator studies something it does not consider a threat, with amusement, with mild curiosity, with the kind of attention you give to a small animal that has wandered into the wrong territory. "What is that?" she asked her senior officer, not bothering to lower her voice. "A human soldier, Commander," the officer replied. "Escort for their ambassador." Valith laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking on stone, and she began to walk toward Elias with the slow, confident stride of someone who had never been afraid of anything in her entire life. She stopped in front of him, and she was a full head taller than he was, and her shadow fell over him like a curtain, and the light from her horn tallies made tiny patterns on his plain gray uniform. "A soldier," she repeated, looking him up and down with open contempt. "This is what humanity sends to protect its interests, a herd animal playing dress-up in a gray cloth. The room began to go quiet, conversation dying in waves, as more and more delegates turned to watch. Elias looked up at her, and his expression did not change, not even a little. And he held his glass of water, the way a man holds something precious, gently, with both hands, as if he was afraid of breaking it. "Tell me, human," Valak said, leaning down so her face was closer to his. "What have your people ever conquered that was worth remembering? What fleets have you broken? What worlds have you claimed? Because I look at you, and I see nothing. I see a species that hides behind words and treaties, while real warriors shape the galaxy." She flicked one of her horn tallies with a sharp claw, and the tiny carved mark caught the light, and the meaning was clear to everyone watching. She was asking him to compare himself to her, knowing he had nothing to show. The room was fully silent now. Elias looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something deep and heavy and very far away, like a sound heard through thick walls. And then it passed, and he set his glass down on the ledge beside the pillar with a soft click, and gave her a small, respectful nod. He said nothing. Valak stared at him, waiting for a response that did not come, and then she turned to the room with her arms spread wide, and her voice rising like a war horn. "You see, this is humanity. Silence and servitude. They send their best, and their best has nothing to say." Her entourage erupted in laughter, and the sound bounced off the glass walls and filled the hall. And a few delegates from other species joined in nervously, because it was easier to laugh with the powerful than to stand against them. Elias picked up his glass of water again and took a small sip, and his hand was perfectly steady, and his face was perfectly still. And if anyone had looked very closely at his eyes, they might have seen something that was not calm at all, but was instead the kind of control that takes everything a person has to maintain. Ambassador Moten appeared at his side a few minutes later, after the crowd had moved on and the noise had returned to normal, and she touched his arm gently and led him to a quiet corner near the observation windows where the dead star hung in the blackness like a faded lantern. "You could have said something," she told him, keeping her voice low. Elias watched the dead star and did not answer right away. "What would be the point?" he finally said, and his voice was quiet and even and carried no anger at all. "The people who know, know. The people who don't, it is better that way." Moten studied his face the way a doctor studies a wound, looking for signs of damage beneath the surface. And she found what she always found. Nothing visible, everything hidden, a man who had learned to bury things so deep that even he could not always find them. "One day someone is going to push you too far," she said. Elias turned away from the window and looked at her, and for just a second his eyes held something ancient and terrible and sad, like the light of a star that had already exploded, but whose glow had not yet reached the worlds that orbited it. "That is what I am afraid of," he said, and then he walked away, and his footsteps made no sound on the glass floor, and the dead star outside continued its slow, cold rotation. And somewhere in the reception hall, Valith Soren was laughing again, loud and bright, and completely unaware that she had just mocked the most dangerous thing in the entire galaxy. Valith Soren sat in her private quarters aboard Threshold that night, and the light from her personal display screens painted her iridescent skin in shades of blue and gold as she replayed the moment in her mind. The human standing there, silent, small, holding his little glass of water like a child at a feast meant for kings. "He did not even speak," she said to her senior officer Kreth, who stood by the door with his arms folded across his broad chest. "Not a single word, not a defense, not even anger, just that pathetic little nod." Kreth nodded and smiled, but there was something careful in the way he held his shoulders, a tension that Valith did not notice, because she was too busy enjoying her own victory. "The summit will go well for us," she continued, standing and walking to the window where the dead star glowed faintly against the black. If their soldier is any sign of their spirit, the humans will fold the moment we push. Quantum system within the week. She turned and looked at Kreth with bright, burning eyes, and her horn tallies caught the light like tiny teeth carved from bone. This is how empires are built, she said, not by fearing the weak, but by showing them where they stand. Kreth said nothing to this, and Valeth did not notice that either. 3 levels below the HFY quarters, in a section of the station where the lights were dimmer and the air tasted of recycled metal, a bar called the Rust Gate served drinks to anyone who could pay, and on this particular night, 3 aliens sat together at a corner table and shared a bottle of something blue and strong. The first was a Gorvathi archivist named Pelin, a squat creature with 4 arms and small clever eyes, who worked in the station's classified records division, and who knew more secrets than most diplomats ever would. The second was a Thoreni mystic called Yaven, tall and thin, with skin like pale silk, and eyes that glowed faintly silver, a seer from a species that could feel the shape of reality itself, the way a blind person feels the edge of a table. The third was an old Rithani war veteran named Goss, heavy and scarred, with a face like cracked stone, and hands that had held weapons on 100 different battlefields across 40 years of service. They had been talking about the reception, about the HFY display, about the way Valeth had humiliated the human soldier in front of the entire hall, and Pelin and Yaven had been laughing about it, not cruelly, but in the way that people laugh when they watch someone walk into a situation they cannot win. But Goss was not laughing. He sat with his drink untouched in front of him, and his old scarred hands were flat on the table, and his eyes were fixed on the surface of the blue liquid as if he could see something moving beneath it. "What is wrong with you, old friend?" Pelin asked, pouring himself another glass. It was funny. You have to admit it was funny. The little human just standing there with his water. "Tell me his name," Goss said, and his voice was low and rough, like stone dragged across stone. Pelin blinked his small eyes. "Whose name?" "The human soldier, the one she mocked. Tell me his name." Yaven tilted her head, her silver eyes flickering with curiosity, and she said, "Why does it matter? He is just an escort, a bodyguard, nothing important." Goss looked up from his drink, and there was something in his face that neither of them had ever seen before. Something that looked very much like fear. "I served in the Coalition support fleet during the Fracture Wars," he said, and both of his companions went still, because the Fracture Wars were not something people talked about easily. The way you do not easily talk about a fire that burned down your childhood home. "I was there when the dimensional rifts opened and the Hollow King sent his armies through. I watched entire fleets disappear into those tears in space, like paper thrown into a furnace." He paused and wrapped his heavy hands around his glass. "We were losing," he continued. "Every species in the Coalition was losing. The HFY lost 3 battle groups in the first month alone, though they will never admit it. The Gorvathi lost their entire outer defense ring. Even the Thoreni seers could not find a way to close the rifts, because the enemy existed in a dimension that followed different rules." Yavene's silver eyes dimmed slightly, and she looked away, because she knew this part of the story was true. Her people still carried the shame of their failure, like a wound that would not heal. "And then the humans did something," Goss said, and his voice dropped so low that Pelin had to lean forward to hear. "Something that the Galactic Council sealed behind the highest classification level ever created. Something that to this day, only a handful of beings in the entire galaxy know the full truth about." "What did they do?" Pelin asked, and all 4 of his hands were now flat on the table. Goss shook his head slowly. "I do not know the details. Nobody outside Human Command does. But I know what I saw. I was on the bridge of a support cruiser in orbit around the rift zone. And one moment, the enemy was pouring through by the millions, and the next moment, there was a flash of light that was not really light at all. It was more like the universe itself flinched, and then the rift was gone. Not closed, gone, as if it had never existed, and the dimension on the other side, the entire realm of the Hollow King, was just. He stopped and stared at his drink. It was just nothing, he whispered. Not empty space, not darkness, nothing. As if someone had taken a piece of reality and simply removed it, the way you remove a page from a book. The table was silent for a long moment. Time. Yaven spoke first, and her voice was barely audible. My people's seers still cannot look into that space. When they try, they do not see void or emptiness. They see an absence so complete that the mind recoils from it. Some of our seers went mad trying to understand what happened there. They said it was as if the universe itself had a wound that refused to heal. Pellin's 4 hands were trembling slightly, and his archivist mind was already racing through files and databases and classification levels. The fracture wars ended 17 cycles ago. The official record says the dimensional threats were neutralized through coalition efforts. There is no mention of any specific operation or operative. Because they buried it, Goss said. They buried it so deep that even most humans do not know. But I was there, Pellin. I saw the aftermath. I saw the faces of the human officers afterward, and they looked like people who had witnessed the death of a god, and could not decide if they should celebrate or weep. You think that soldier, Pellin began. Find his name, Goss said again. And this time it was not a request. Pellin hesitated, but the look in the old veteran's eyes was enough, and he pulled out a small data device and connected to the station's network. And his 4 hands moved across the interface with the speed of someone who had spent a lifetime pulling secrets from locked boxes. It took him several minutes, and during those minutes nobody spoke, and the bar continued its noise around them, as if the universe had not just shifted beneath their feet. I have his file, Helen finally said, and his voice sounded strange, thin and hollow, like a bell that has been struck too hard. Or what is left of it. Most of it is redacted. Classification level Omega Black. I have never even heard of that level before. His name, rank, and current assignment are visible, but everything else is redacted. The device so the others could see, and the screen showed page after page of black bars, thick dark lines covering words and numbers and entire paragraphs. And between those bars, like bones poking through dark earth, a few fragments remained visible. His name was Sergeant Elias Kane. His current assignment was diplomatic escort. And at the very bottom of the file, in a section marked After Action Summary, Operation Threshold Break, one line had survived the censors, perhaps by accident, or perhaps because someone wanted it to remain as a warning. It read, Realm Status Collapsed. Sole Surviving Operative, SGT E. Kane. Pellin put the device down slowly, and his 4 hands retreated to his lap, and he stared at the table as if the surface might crack open and swallow him. He did it alone, Yevhen whispered, and her silver eyes were wide with something that was not curiosity anymore, but was instead a kind of horror that seers feel when they look at something that should not exist. Goss picked up his drink at last and drained it in one long swallow, and when he set the glass down, his hand was shaking. And she mocked him, he said quietly. She stood in front of him and called him weak, and he just stood there and took it. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the kind of control that takes? A man who erased an entire reality held a glass of water and said nothing while she laughed in his face. Above them, several levels up in the quiet of his assigned quarters, Elias Kane sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands, and the room was dark and silent. And in the silence, he could hear things that were not really sounds at all, but were instead memories that had carved themselves so deep into his mind that they had become part of him. He heard the cracking, like glass shattering across an infinite distance. He saw light pouring from fractures in a sky that was not a sky, but was the boundary of an entire dimension coming apart at the seams. He felt the screaming, not with his ears, but with his bones, frequencies that no human was meant to feel. The sound of 9 billion voices crying out in a language he had never learned, but understood perfectly, because terror sounds the same in every tongue. And then the silence. The terrible, absolute, permanent silence of a place that had simply stopped existing. Elias closed his hands into fists and pressed them against his forehead. And he breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly. And he pushed the memories back down into the dark place where he kept them. And he reminded himself of the same thing he reminded himself every single night. It had to be done. It had to be someone. And he was the only one left. He opened his hands and looked at them again. Just hands. Just ordinary human hands with calluses and small scars and short nails. And he marveled, as he always did, how something so small could have done something so vast and terrible and final. Outside his window, the dead star turned slowly in the black, and somewhere on the station, a proud HFY warrior was sleeping peacefully, her horn tallies gleaming in the dark, completely unaware that her greatest conquest tally would not equal 1 second of what the quiet man in the gray uniform had survived. The summit chamber was a massive circular room at the heart of Threshold, built from dark stone and silver metal, with a dome ceiling that showed the stars outside through transparent panels. And when the delegations gathered there on the second morning, it felt like standing inside a cathedral built for gods who had long since moved on. Every species had its place at the great curved table. The Gorvathi, with their 4 arms folded in patient silence. The Thereni, with their glowing eyes watching everything. The Rhythani, heavy and still like boulders, placed at the edge of a river. And a dozen others whose names and shapes filled the room with a chaos of color and sound. The human delegation sat in their assigned section, Ambassador Modin at the center, with data screens and treaty documents spread before her, and behind her, Elias stood against the wall in his plain gray uniform, still and quiet as a shadow painted on stone. Velit Soreni entered the chamber like a blade entering a wound, sharp, bright, impossible to ignore, and her officers flanked her in perfect formation, their armor polished and their horn tallies gleaming, and the sound of their boots on the stone floor was like a drumbeat, announcing that the real power in the room had arrived. The morning session began with territorial claims and resource disputes, and for the first 2 hours the discussions were dry and careful, full of legal language and historical precedent, and the kind of words that diplomats use when they want to say something dangerous without sounding dangerous. But everyone knew what was coming. The quantum mineral system, designation KV4471, sat at the border between human claimed space and HFY claimed space, and both species needed those minerals for their faster-than-light drive cores, and whoever controlled that system would have a technological advantage for the next 50 years. Ambassador Motin presented humanity's claim first, and she did it beautifully. 20 minutes of data, treaties, survey records, and historical precedent, delivered in a calm, clear voice that made every fact sound like a stone being placed into a wall that could not be pushed over. When she finished, Valith rose to speak, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "The human ambassador speaks well," Valith said, and her voice carried the kind of sweetness that poison wears when it wants to be swallowed. "She speaks of treaties and surveys and records. She speaks the language of those who build their empires on paper because they cannot build them in the stars." She placed her hands on the table and leaned forward, and the light caught her horn tallies and threw sharp little shadows across the polished surface. The 8th Kari do not claim KV-4471 because of what is written. We claim it because we are strong enough to hold it, because our fleets patrol those borders, because our warriors bleed for every system we call ours. And what do the humans offer in return? Words, documents, and a soldier who cannot even speak when spoken to. She turned and looked directly at Elias, and several delegates followed her gaze, and Elias did not move, did not blink, did not react in any way that was visible to anyone watching. Moten kept her composure, but her jaw tightened just slightly, and she responded with more data, more precedent, more calm, unbreakable logic, and for a while, it seemed like the session might proceed as these things usually did. Slowly, painfully, but peacefully. Then Valith changed the game. She stood again, and raised her hand in a formal gesture that made every 8th Kari in the room straighten, and every alien who knew 8th Kari customs go very still. "I invoke Kalvethru," she said, and her voice rang through the chamber like a bell made of iron. The room erupted in murmurs. Kalvethru was an ancient 8th Kari tradition, challenge of martial honor that had been recognized by the Galactic Council as a legitimate diplomatic tool because the Ethkari had insisted upon it as a condition of joining the Council 300 years ago. The rules were simple. If one delegation questioned the strength and resolve of another, they could demand that the challenged delegation produce a champion to face their own in single combat. The result of that combat would carry the weight of a formal diplomatic verdict in the eyes of every species that recognized the tradition. It was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. The Ethkari were physically superior to humans in almost every way, faster, stronger, with reflexes that could track a bullet in flight, and Valith herself was considered the finest warrior of her generation, undefeated in formal combat across 11 campaigns. "If humanity believes it deserves KV-4471, Valith said, looking at Moten with eyes that burned like twin furnaces, "then let humanity prove it, not with paper, not with words, but with strength. Send your champion to face me in the ring, or withdraw your claim, and let the galaxy see what human resolve truly looks like." Moten did not show what she felt, because 20 years of diplomacy had taught her how to keep her face as still as stone, even when the ground was breaking beneath her feet. But inside her chest, her heart was hammering, because she understood exactly what was happening. If she refused, humanity would lose credibility with every species that recognized Kalvethru, and that was most of them. And their territorial claim would be weakened, not just for this system, but for every negotiation that followed for the next generation. If she accepted, she was sending someone into a ring with the most dangerous 8th Kari warrior alive. She looked at Elias. He had not moved from his place against the wall, and his face was the same as it always was. Calm, quiet, empty of anything that could be read. But when their eyes met, something passed between them that was not spoken, and did not need to be. Moten requested a brief recess, and the chamber cleared slowly as delegates filed out in groups, talking in hushed voices about what had just happened. And Valith smiled as she left, because she believed she had already won. In a small private room off the main corridor, Moten and Elias stood facing each other, and the door was sealed, and the walls were soundproofed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Can you do this?" Moten asked, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "Probably," Elias said. "That is not what I am asking," Moten said, and she took a step closer and lowered her voice. "Can you do this without becoming what you were? Can you step into that ring and fight her, and stay in control? Because if you cannot, I need to know now." Elias was quiet for a long time, and in that silence, Moten could almost feel the weight of the things he carried. Invisible and enormous, like a mountain that exists just below the surface of a still lake. "I do not know," he finally said, and those 4 words were the most honest thing he had said in years. Before Moten could respond, The door chimed and Warden Tosk entered, all four arms folded behind his back, his massive Gorvathi frame filling the doorway like a wall made of muscle and duty. "Ambassador," he said, and his deep voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing every word the way a surgeon chooses every cut. "I need to speak with you about your escort." "What about him?" Moten asked. Tosk looked at Elias, and something passed through his expression, not fear exactly, but something close to it, the kind of respect that sits right next to terror and shares a border with both. "I have read his file," Tosk said. "The real one, not the version the Council shows to diplomats. Requires 3 separate biometric confirmations and a direct authorization from the Council's security chair." Moten said nothing, but her hands tightened at her sides. "If he steps into that ring and loses control," Tosk said, and his voice was barely above a whisper now, "I cannot guarantee the safety of this station. I cannot guarantee the safety of this sector. The containment protocols we have here are designed for conventional threats, and what is inside your sergeant is not conventional by any definition I have ever encountered." The room was very quiet. "And if I refuse the challenge?" Moten asked. Tosk unfolded one pair of arms and spread them in a gesture that meant helplessness in Gorvathi culture. "Then humanity loses its seat at this table for a generation. The Ethkari know this, which is why they chose this strategy. They believe they cannot lose." He paused and looked at Elias again, and Elias looked back. And what passed between the two men was the recognition that soldiers share when they both understand the cost of what is about to happen. "They believe they cannot lose because they do not know what they are facing," Tosk said quietly. "The question is whether that is a mercy or a tragedy." Moten closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were clear and hard and decided. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Stay in control," she said, and it was not a request, it was a prayer. Elias nodded once, and then he walked out of the room and toward the dueling ring that was already being prepared in the lower level of the summit chamber. And his footsteps were quiet and steady, and his breathing was even, and his hands hung at his sides, completely relaxed. In the observation gallery that overlooked the ring, delegates were already gathering, pressing against the railings to get a better view, and the noise of their conversations was like the buzzing of a hive that senses a storm approaching. Valith was already in the ring, stretching her long limbs and rolling her shoulders, and her armor caught the light and threw it back in shards of color, and she looked magnificent and terrifying and absolutely certain of her victory. When Elias entered the ring in his plain gray uniform, with no armor and no weapons, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, because he looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong room at the wrong time. Valith looked at him and smiled, and her smile was sharp enough to cut. "So the silent soldier speaks at last," she said, "with his fists if not his tongue. Good, I prefer it this way." In the gallery above, the old Rithani veteran Goss pushed through the crowd until he reached the railing, and he looked down at the ring and saw the human standing there, small and quiet, in his gray uniform, and his scarred old hands gripped the railing so hard that the metal groaned. The person beside him, a young Thoreni diplomat who was watching with excitement, and grabbed their arm. "We need to leave," he whispered, and his voice was shaking. "We need to leave now." But even as he said it, the heavy doors of the observation gallery sealed shut, with a deep metallic sound that echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat. And below, in the ring, Elias Kane looked up at the ceiling, and then he looked at Valith, and then he breathed in once, long and slow, and something behind his eyes shifted. Not anger, not aggression, but something much older and much heavier, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for a very long time. The duel began. Valith moved first, because Ethkari warriors always move first. It was their way, their pride, their blood-deep belief that the one who strikes first controls the shape of the battle. And she was fast, so fast that most species in the galaxy could not have tracked her movement with their eyes. She closed the distance between them in a single breath, and brought her fist down toward Elias's head, in a strike that carried enough force to crack reinforced steel. And her horn tallies caught the light as she moved. And she was beautiful in the way that destruction is beautiful, the way a falling star is beautiful just before it hits the ground. Elias stepped to the side, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small, precise movement that placed him exactly where her fist was not. And the air from her missed strike brushed past his cheek like a whisper from a world that wanted to hurt him but could not reach. Valeth spun and struck again, faster this time. Combination of blows that flowed from one to the next like water pouring over stones, and each one was aimed at a vital point. Each one was delivered with the skill of someone who had trained since childhood and fought since adolescence, and won since the day she first picked up a weapon. She hit him. Her third strike caught his shoulder, and the impact spun him sideways. And the crowd above gasped, and Valeth pressed her advantage, raining blows on him with the furious precision of a storm that has found a target and will not let it go. Elias blocked some of them, deflected others, and absorbed the rest, and his body moved in a way that was not graceful and not impressive, but was instead purely functional, the movement of a man who was not trying to win, but was simply trying to survive, without breaking something far more dangerous than bones. "Fight me," Valeth snarled between strikes, and her voice was heavy with frustration, because she had expected resistance, had expected a battle, had expected the human to at least try. "Fight me, human, or is standing still all your kind can do?" Elias said nothing, and continued to absorb her strikes, and the crowd began to murmur with disappointment, because this was not the spectacle they had come to see. This was not a duel, this was a beating, and the human was just taking it. But down in the ring, something else was happening, something that only Elias could feel. Every time Valeth hit him, the impact sent a shockwave not through his body, but through something deeper, through the place inside him where the breaker protocol lived, where the connection to the fabric of reality itself had been burned into his consciousness like a brand pressed into living flesh. And with each impact, memories surged upward like water rising in a well. He saw the briefing room, 17 years ago. 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle, 12 soldiers sitting in them, and a general standing at the front, with a face that looked like it had already attended its own funeral. "The Hollow King's forces are pouring through the dimensional rifts faster than we can close them," the general had said. "Coalition losses are at 67% and rising. Conventional weapons cannot harm entities that exist across multiple dimensional planes. We have tried everything." He paused and looked at each of them in turn. "Project Breaker is our last option. The procedure will fuse your neural architecture with the dimensional fault lines themselves, allowing you to interact directly with the structure of reality. You will be able to see the seams that hold dimensions together, and you will be able to pull them apart." 12 soldiers in 12 chairs, and none of them moved, and none of them spoke, because they all understood what was being asked and what it would cost. "I will not pretend this is safe," the general said. "Suggest a survival rate of 8%. Those who survive may experience permanent neurological changes. Those who do not survive will experience." He stopped and swallowed hard. "The procedure itself is the most painful thing we have ever developed. We cannot use anesthesia because the neural pathways must be active during the fusion. I am asking you to let us reshape the way your brain connects to the universe while you are fully conscious and fully aware." 12 volunteers, 11 screams that ended in silence or madness. Elias was the 12th, and he remembered the pain the way you remember drowning, not as a memory, but as a fact written into every cell of his body. And when it was over, he could see things that no human was meant to see, the threads that held reality together, the boundaries between what was and what was not, the thin, shining lines that separated one dimension from another, like strings holding up a curtain. Through the rift alone, because one person drew less attention than an army, and he walked into the Hollow King's realm the way a man walks into a burning building. Not because he was brave, but because someone had to, and there was nobody else left. In the ring, Valith landed another strike, this one to his ribs, and Elias stumbled, and the crowd cheered for the HFY champion, and the memories kept rising. The Hollow King's realm had been vast and terrible and alive in ways that defied human understanding. A dimension where thought had weight, and fear had color, and the sky was made of something that screamed when you looked at it too long. 9 billion beings lived there, not all of them soldiers, not all of them enemies. There were cities, and farms, and children, and songs, and a civilization that had existed for millennia before the Hollow King had risen and bent them all to war. Elias saw all of this in the seconds before he did what he had been sent to do. He reached out with the part of his mind that the Breaker Protocol had created, the part that could feel the seams of reality, and he found the threads that held the Hollow King's dimension together, and they were thick and ancient and deeply woven into the fabric of existence. He pulled. From outside, from the Coalition fleet watching through sensors, it took 11 seconds. 11 seconds during which every instrument spiked, and every alarm screamed, and every officer on every bridge went silent. From inside, it lasted years. Elias felt every thread as it snapped, felt the dimension shudder and crack like ice on a deep lake, felt the cities crumble and the mountains dissolve, and the sky tear open like cloth pulled too far. And through it all he felt them, 9 billion souls, felt their confusion and their terror and their desperate, hopeless prayers to gods that were coming apart along with everything else. Parents who were already gone. He felt the Hollow King's rage, vast and ancient and utterly helpless, as the tyrant realized that his entire reality was being unmade by a single creature from a species he had dismissed as insignificant. And then there was nothing. Not darkness, not void, not empty space, nothing. A hole in the fabric of existence so complete that the universe itself seemed to flinch away from it the way skin flinches from a burn. Elias walked back through the rift, and the rift closed behind him, and he stood on the deck of a Coalition ship and looked at the officers staring at him with faces full of horror and awe, and something that was very close to religious terror. He had not spoken for 3 days after that. In the ring, Valith struck his cheek with a cutting blow, and his blood hit the floor, bright red against the dark stone, and the room went silent in a way that silence should not feel, heavy and thick and charged, like the air before lightning. Elias stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, and the blood ran down his cheek in a thin line. And he looked at it the way a man looks at a crack in a dam, not with fear, but with the grim recognition that something is about to change. The air in the ring shifted. It was not something anyone could see, but everyone could feel it. A change in pressure, a change in temperature, a change in something deeper and more fundamental than either of those, as if the space around Elias had suddenly become thinner, more fragile, more aware of itself. On the observation gallery above, Warden Tosk was gripping his console with all 4 hands, and his screens were filled with readings that should not have been possible. Dimensional stability metrics were fluctuating. Energy signatures were spiking in patterns that did not correspond to any known technology, and at the center of every reading was a single point. Valith launched her next strike, a perfect, devastating blow aimed at his chest that carried the full weight of her HFY strength and the full fury of a warrior who was tired of fighting someone who would not fight back. Elias caught it. His hand came up and wrapped around her fist, and he held it there. and the impact that should have shattered every bone in his hand simply stopped, absorbed, swallowed, as if her strength had poured into something so deep it could not find the bottom. Vaelith tried to pull back, and could not. The energy readings in the ring went haywire. Every sensor on the station screamed. And for one brief, terrible moment, the space around Elias seemed to thin until it was almost transparent. And through that thinness, something could almost be seen. Not a place, not a vision, but an absence. The ghost of a realm that no longer existed. The shadow of 9 billion voices that had been silenced in 11 seconds. Felt it. She felt it not in her body, but in her soul. In the deepest part of her being where instinct lives and fear is born. And what she felt was not the fear of death, because death was something she had faced many times and had learned to laugh at. What she felt was the fear of unbeing, the terror of looking into something that was not dark and not empty, but was simply not, as if the man holding her fist was standing at the edge of a hole in everything, and that hole was part of him, and it was hungry and vast and patient. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged animal trying to escape, and for the first time in her life her hand was shaking, and she looked into the eyes of the human soldier, and what she saw there was not anger, it was grief. The grief of a man who had killed a world and carried it inside him every single day, and the terrible knowledge that he could do it again, and the desperate hope that he would never have to. Held her fist for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 3 centuries. And then he released it, and he stepped back, and he breathed, and the air in the ring normalized, and the sensor readings dropped back to baseline, and the thinness in the space around him sealed itself shut, like a wound closing. "Yield," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady, and full of something that sounded very much like begging. "Please." The ring was silent. The entire station was silent. On Tosk's console, a single alert blinked in red letters against a black screen. Dimensional stability warning. Anomaly source dueling ring. Status resolved. And Tosk stared at it, with all 4 hands still locked on the console, and his massive body perfectly motionless. In the gallery, Goss the Rithani veteran had tears running down his scarred stone face, because he recognized what he had just felt. He had felt it once before, 17 years ago, standing on the bridge of a support cruiser, watching an entire dimension disappear. And in the ring, Vaelith Soren stood with her fist still extended in the air where Elias had released it, and her hand was shaking, and her horn tallies were dark in the dim light. And for the first time in her life, she understood that there were things in the universe that conquest could not touch, and glory could not measure, and strength could not defeat. She understood that the quiet man in the gray uniform was not weak. He was something far more terrifying than strong. He was broken, and inside the broken places he carried the end of everything, and his greatest act of power was the act of holding it all together, every second of every day, so that no one else would ever have to feel what he felt when he shattered a realm. The silence in the dueling ring lasted for what felt like a lifetime, stretching out across the chamber and the gallery and the corridors beyond, like a wave that had forgotten how to break. And in that silence, every being on threshold held their breath without knowing why, as if the universe itself was waiting for something to be decided. Vaelith stood in the ring, with her fist still raised in the empty air, and her body was trembling in a way it had never trembled before. Not from exhaustion, not from injury, but from something deeper and more honest than either. From the shock of understanding how small she was. She had spent her entire life carving tallies into her horns, and each tally had been a victory, and each victory had been proof that she was strong, that she mattered, that the universe would remember her name. And now she stood in front of a man who had erased an entire world, and she understood that all her tallies together were less than dust compared to the weight he carried in silence. She lowered her fist. She lowered it slowly, and the movement was not surrender, but something harder and braver than surrender. It was recognition, the kind that costs everything, because it means admitting that the story you have been telling yourself your entire life is not the only story, and may not even be the truest one. "I yield," she said, and her voice was rough and quiet and stripped of every pretense she had ever worn. "I yield the Calva through." The gallery above erupted, not in cheers, not in boos, but in the confused and frightened murmuring of hundreds of beings who had just witnessed something they did not fully understand, but could feel in the marrow of their bones. Elias stood where he was, and the blood was still drying on his cheek, and his hands were at his sides, and he looked at Valeth with an expression that held no triumph and no satisfaction, only relief, deep and heavy and exhausted. Man who had walked to the edge of an abyss and managed to step back. He nodded to her once, the same small, respectful nod he had given her at the reception when she first mocked him, and then he turned and walked out of the ring, and his footsteps were quiet on the stone floor, and nobody tried to stop him or speak to him or touch him. In the gallery, Goss wiped his eyes with his scarred hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Warden Tosk locked down every sensor log from the past 10 minutes and classified them at a level that only 3 beings on the station had clearance to access. And then he sat heavily in his chair and stared at the dark ceiling and breathed the way a man breathes when he has just watched a catastrophe decide not to happen. The summit resumed 2 hours later, and it was a different summit than the one that had begun that morning. Valeth's delegation withdrew their claim to KV 4471, formally, completely, without conditions, and Valeth herself made the announcement in a voice that was calm and clear and carried none of the fire that had burned in it before. She did not explain her reasons. She did not need to. Every delegate in that chamber had felt what happened in the ring, even if they could not name it, and the Aethkari withdrawal was accepted without argument or question. And Ambassador Moten closed the session with the quiet, steady grace of someone who understood that the victory she had just won was not the kind you celebrate. It was the kind you grieve. The hours that followed were strange and soft, the way time feels after a storm has passed, and the world is still deciding whether it is safe to move again. And delegates drifted through the corridors of Threshold in small groups, speaking in low voices about what they had seen and felt. The stories spread the way stories do, not through official channels, but through whispers and glances and the particular silence that falls when someone asks a question and nobody wants to answer it. Nobody said exactly what had happened in the ring, but everyone said the same thing about the human, the one in the gray uniform, the one with no medals, the one who had stood still while an Aethkari champion tried to break him, and had then done something that made the air itself feel thin, and the ground feel uncertain, and the walls feel like paper held up against a hurricane. The Rithani veteran told his version in the Rustgate bar, and he told it quietly, and the beings who listened did not interrupt, and did not laugh, and did not ask questions when he was done. The Thereni mystic told her people through a psychic link that crossed light years, and the seers who received her message went very still, and did not speak for the rest of the day. And in every version of the story, the same truth lived at the center, like a seed buried in dark earth. Something terrible during the Fracture Wars, and that terrible thing was a man, and that man had been mocked and humiliated in front of the entire galaxy, and he had responded with silence and patience and a mercy so vast it was almost unbearable. Late that evening, when the corridors were quiet and most of the delegates had retreated to their quarters, Valeth found Elias on the observation deck. He was standing at the window, looking out at the dead star, and his reflection in the glass was faint and transparent, a ghost of a man layered over the ghost of a sun. And she thought that this was perhaps the most honest image of him she had ever seen. She approached without her retinue, without her armor, without any of the things she usually wore to tell the world who she was, and she stood beside him and looked out at the same darkness. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "How many?" she finally asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. Elias did not look at her, and his eyes stayed fixed on the dead star, as if he could see something in its faded light that no one else could see. "One realm," he said. "Approximately 9 billion souls." Valeth closed her eyes. "I felt every single one," he added, and his voice cracked on the last word, just barely, just enough for her to hear. And it was the first time she had heard any emotion from him at all. She opened her eyes and looked at his reflection in the glass, and she saw the crack in him now, the thin line that ran through everything he was, held together by nothing but will and habit and the desperate, stubborn refusal to let go. "Why did you not fight back in the ring?" she asked. "You could have ended it in a second. Why did you let me hit you?" Elias was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady again, but it was the steadiness of a bridge that knows exactly how much weight it can carry, and is currently holding all of it. "Because if I started, I was not sure I could stop," he said, "and you did not deserve what I am." Valeth felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been rigid and proud and certain for as long as she could remember. And it did not break, but it bent, the way metal bends when enough pressure is applied slowly enough. And in the space that opened up, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Humility. Not the humility of defeat, but the humility of understanding. The understanding that her entire culture of conquest and tallies and glory was a game played by children who had never been asked to pay the real price of power. She did not pity him. She was still Aithkari, and pity was not in her nature. But she respected him in a way she had never respected anyone, the way you respect a mountain, not because it is tall, but because it chooses to stay still. "I am sorry for what I said at the reception," she told him. And the words were difficult, because apology was not something Aithkari warriors practiced. But she meant them, and he could hear that she meant them. "You did not know," he said simply, and there was no anger in it, and no blame, just the quiet acceptance of a man who had long ago stopped expecting anyone to understand. They stood together at the window for a long time after that. Two soldiers from two worlds, separated by everything, except the one thing that connected all warriors across every species and every star. The knowledge that the hardest battles are the ones nobody sees, the ones fought inside, the ones that have no tallies and no glory and no end. The next morning, Elias boarded a transport back to human space. Ambassador Moten sat beside him in the small passenger compartment, and the hum of the engines filled the air with a low vibration that settled into the bones like a lullaby sung by machines. And she looked at him and wanted to ask, "All right," but already knew the answer. "One day this will get easier," she said instead, and she did not believe it, but she said it anyway, because sometimes hope is not about truth, but about choosing to offer comfort, even when comfort is not possible. Elias watched the stars through the narrow window as the transport pulled away from threshold, and the dead star shrank behind them, growing smaller and dimmer, until it was just another point of light in the vast, uncaring darkness. "I keep thinking that one day I will stop hearing them," he said. Moten looked at him, and her throat tightened. "The 9 billion, she asked. "No," he said, and his voice was so quiet she almost could not hear it over the engines, the silence where they used to be. Moten did not say anything after that, because there was nothing in any language on any world that could answer a sentence like that, and so she simply sat beside him, and the transport carried them forward into the dark, and the stars moved around them like witnesses who had seen everything and would say nothing. Back on threshold, in the observation deck, where two soldiers had stood and spoken and understood each other across the impossible distance between their worlds, Valeth Soren stood alone. She stood at the same window and looked out at the same dead star, and her reflection stared back at her. Tall, beautiful, iridescent, crowned with the curved horns that carried her tallies, her conquests, her identity. Everything she had ever been told mattered. She raised one hand and touched the first tally, the one she had earned at 17, her first fleet engagement, the victory that had made her father weep with pride, and she ran her finger along its edge, feeling the groove cut deep into the bone. Then she reached into her belt and pulled out a small metal file, standard issue, meant for armor maintenance, and she pressed it against the base of that first tally. The sound it made was small and sharp, like a whisper made of metal. She drew the file across the tally, and a thin curl of bone fell away and drifted to the floor. Then she moved to the next one, and the next, and the next. One by one, she filed them down. Every conquest, every victory, every mark she had ever earned, and the bone dust collected on the floor around her feet, like snow falling in a room that had never seen winter. And with every tally that disappeared, she felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the weight of pretending was gone, and heavier because the weight of understanding had taken its place. She did not cry, because she was still Aithkari, and Aithkari warriors do not cry. But her hands were steady, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright, with something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of strength. The kind that does not need to prove itself, the kind that does not need to be seen. Kind that holds itself together quietly in the dark and asks for nothing in return. Outside the window, the dead star turned in the silence of space, and the galaxy continued its slow, ancient rotation around a center that no one had ever reached. And somewhere in the vast web of stars and species and civilizations, a quiet truth was spreading from world to world, carried not by transmissions or reports, but by the memory of what had been felt in a dueling ring on a station orbiting a corpse of light. The truth was simple, and it was this: do not mistake human silence for weakness. Do not mistake human patience for surrender. Do not mistake human mercy for inability. Because the humans ended the greatest war the galaxy had ever known, not with fleets or armies or weapons of mass destruction, but with a single man who loved the universe enough to break himself rather than let it fall. And the most extraordinary thing about humanity was not that they had created such a terrible power, but that they chose every single day not to use it again. And in the cold, quiet dark between the stars, a transport carried one tired soldier home. And he did not sleep, and he did not speak, and he held his hands in his lap, and looked at them the way he always did. Just hands. Just ordinary human hands. And he marveled at how something so small could carry something so heavy, and still find the strength to be gentle. The stars burned on around him, ancient and indifferent, and the silence between them was vast, but it was not the silence he feared. That silence lived inside him, and it always would, and every day he woke up and chose to carry it instead of letting it carry him. And that choice, that small, impossible daily choice, was the bravest thing in the galaxy.